is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. The Department of Justice announces 4 listening sessions on missing and murdered Indigenous women. Operation Lady Justice is the name of the presidential task force. The sessions will take place online due to the pandemic health crisis. 2 sessions will be held next week and 2 more the first week of June. From the sessions, the task force will present a progress report to the president at the end of November. To join the listening sessions, you can sign up on the Department of Justice website. The impact COVID-19 is having on women is the subject of a report by the United Nations. According to the report, the pandemic has exacerbated gender inequality against women and also outlines the history of women and pandemics. Some key findings include the rise of domestic violence against women. The report was shared online by Ethnic Media Services. The session called The Shadow Pandemic, COVID-19's Impact on Women is archived on the Ethnic Media Services website. Former leaders from the Crow Creek Sioux tribe are sentenced to prison for embezzlement. The tribe is located in South Dakota. The U.S. attorney there prosecuted 6 council members for stealing about $1 million in tribal money and assets. The crime went on for nearly 5 years, from March 2014 to February 2019. Former chairwoman Roxanne Sazu was sentenced to 10 months. Under the terms, she will spend 5 months in prison and 5 months on house arrest. Sazu was ordered to pay nearly $43,000 in restitution. Former council member Tina Gray Owl received the same sentence, but her restitution will be ordered at a later date. In addition, both will have to serve 2 years of supervised release after their sentences. 3 defendants are already serving time. They include the former treasurer, Roland Hawk Sr., sentenced to 42 months and more than $300,000 in restitution. Former council member Francine Middleton sentenced to 30 months and nearly $300,000 in restitution. The tribe's former finance officer, Jacqueline Pease, was sentenced to 3 years on probation and ordered to pay more than $74,000 in restitution. A 6th defendant, Brandon Sazu, will be sentenced on June 16th. Now for the latest numbers of COVID-19 cases in Indian Country, let's go to our Washington editor, Jordan Bennett-Begay. Jordan?
So 5 tribes announced more cases, while 1 tribe in Minnesota reported their first confirmed COVID-19 case. And the latest numbers from our database show that there are now 6,388 positive confirmed cases and 185 deaths within the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 6,388 positive confirmed cases and 185 deaths as of this morning. The chairman of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians in Minnesota announced their first positive case of COVID-19 on their reservation. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians in Mississippi reported 21 new cases, and the Chairman Cyrus Ben declared a state of public health emergency for the tribe. They now have a total of 373 cases and 21 deaths. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma announced 3 more cases, and this gives the tribe 79 cases in total. And also in Oklahoma, the Choctaw Nation saw 1 more case, and now they have a total of 112 positive confirmed cases within their tribal jurisdiction. And in Arizona, the White Mountain Apache tribe reported 29 more cases. This gives the tribe a total of 516 cases on their reservation. And the Navajo Nation, that spans across Arizona and parts of New Mexico and Utah, reported 181 new cases and 1 additional death. Tribal officials say this gives the tribe a total of 4,424 cases and 147 deaths. And the Navajo Nation will be undergoing another 57-hour weekend lockdown that starts at 8 o'clock this evening.
Any word on Gallup and is the city of Gallup, which is in New Mexico and on the border of the Navajo Nation, as well as the Zuni and Acoma and Laguna Pueblos. Will Gallup also be on lockdown this weekend?
I haven't seen anything about what Gallup is doing, but the president now, Jonathan Nez, are saying essential workers are allowed to go out as long as they have a piece of paper for them saying they're essential. And they're also encouraging for people to go get groceries and medicines before the curfew begins.
Thank you so much, Jordan Benebigay.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back. Welcome back. On Fridays, we have our Reporters Roundtable, and this week we're joined by Colby Kickingwoman. He is our reporter based in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Colby.
Patty, thank you for having me.
Also joining us from Minneapolis, Minnesota is Eddie Chukalate, and he's a freelance reporter based there. Hi, Eddie.
Hello.
Well, we're deep in the coverage of this pandemic here and looking at how it's impacting Indian country. Eddie, you wrote a story recently, an obituary about a man who recently lost his life in this pandemic. And he was a well-beloved member of the community there in Minneapolis. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Jerry, he was from Boyd's Fort, which is in northern Minnesota. He had also lived in Duluth, but for the last 10 years, he was lived here in what some people call the most densest urban Indian population in America. It's the Phillips neighborhood in South Minneapolis. And he had just moved in within the last year to it wasn't a nursing home, but it was a sort of an assisted living center, but he was free to come and go as he pleased. And his brother said this one day he came down with it, and they took him to the hospital by ambulance, and then his brother was notified, and he was in the hospital, in the VA hospital, for about 3 weeks, and just a slow downhill death, and he was a smoker and had diabetes, and it just attacked his respiratory system.
And that was Jerry James Lightfeather. He was very active in the community there. I understand he was like a cultural bearer.
Right. He was a fluent Ojibwe speaker, and anytime someone needed translation or to do ceremonies, he was one of the first people they would call, and he was always willing to do it, and good-natured, and just loved to do stuff like that, and that's where he'll be missed.
So quite a person in the community who people reached out to for many different occasions. And how long was he in the hospital before he passed away?
It was about 3 weeks. And the bad thing about it was no one could really go and see him because people would be advised by the VA that there's a chance that if you even setting foot in the hospital in any fashion, you're going to have a chance of getting it. So they strongly suggested no one come to visit him. But they on his birthday, they set up a video monitor visit with his brother, and his brother was able to take a screenshot. And he's laying in his bed. You can tell he's got a big smile on his face. The next day, he died.
Yeah, and that photo that is in your story kind of shows his whole character, that even though he was sick and in a hospital bed, he was still smiling. He was still, telling jokes and making people around him feel a little bit better.
Right. And he was telling people, that he didn't want them to risk getting infected by coming to see him, to stay away. And that's the type of guy he was. I never had a chance to meet him, but I was able to meet his brother. He was still here. And even to the sad fact of his belongings, they had to, dispose of his belongings because they didn't know if that stuff would be infected too, like his wallet and his clothes. So they just had to bury that stuff. And then his funeral up in northern Minnesota was only attended by like 10 people because of social distancing. And it was like his brother said it was, definitely not a normal farewell that they would have had for him, but as you have to do what you have to do.
And that's the tragedy of this whole pandemic, is the loss of people like Jerry, who are fluent speakers, who have that knowledge, and no longer can teach that. So Indian Country Today is following a lot of these people, and we want to do as many obituaries that we can to put a face to the numbers and to tell stories like Jerry's story that you did, and to explain who he was in the community. And this guy really had an impact.
All right. And it's unfortunate that the disease attacks that population that, is fluent and does know all the traditions and willing to share them. It just so happens that they're in that demographic that the disease attacks, especially, if you have underlying conditions. And with him, it was age, underlying conditions, and he was a smoker, which I've heard, I don't know for sure, but I've heard that being a smoker doesn't help because, the disease attacks the lungs. And they said that he just couldn't get used to it. He wasn't on a respirator. He refused that, but he was on oxygen. And even then, he was always pulling it out. He just didn't like it in his mouth. He just kept pulling it out. And when he died, he had it out. I'm not saying that would have that was the reason, but they did say when he passed away, he had taken out his little oxygen thing.
Yeah. Well, again, covering these stories and sharing the life of the people who are losing to COVID-19, I think is important, so that Indian Country, maybe that also resonates with other people. And this idea of how do you flatten the curve, how do you stay safe by staying home and not being out and about. So that was one of the stories that you reported here. And the other one that you wrote recently had to do with the homeless population.
Yeah, that is, I've only been in Minneapolis since October, and like two or 3 years ago, they had what they call the Wall of Forgotten Natives, and it was an encampment that started, and it grew to about 300 or 400 people. And in essence, it was a protest of what they perceive as lack of cultural specific native housing for the homeless here. And that is, especially with the pandemic, there's another encampment growing. It's not only natives, it's all races, and it's growing again. They're having another encampment, and the county went in, and the Minneapolis mayor said, and the governor said, instead of just going in and trying to just disperse everything, we're going to try to help these people out. So they put a fence around them and put up some sanitary stations like bathrooms and stuff like that. But still, though, like I was talking to one of the Michael Goes, who's he runs a lot of programs here for Indian housing, and they have set up a tent with sanitary supplies, masks, gloves, and portable showers for mainly natives, but anyone can use it. And Mr. Goes was telling me that it's not a picnic. Living in a tent in the city, you'd be better off living in a tent in the woods, because here there's so many different people. You never know what's going on. You got a lot of crime, because a lot of people will prey on the unfortunate. So it's like he said, it's not a picnic. But there's a native homeless population here right in the middle of Minneapolis. They're all set up in tents.
And I understand that the city is bracing for even more positive cases and also potentially deaths in June.
All right. They have it, some models, and predicting an uptick in deaths. And just yesterday, I think Minnesota had 32, which was an all-time high. It'd been steady at, I'd say, in the mid-20s for weeks as far as deaths. But yesterday it hit 32, and one model has, which I found hard to believe, but I do believe it, 100 deaths a day for the last week in June. 100 deaths a day. That's I just can't fathom that. Going from 30 now to 100 something. So it's definitely not over. Actually, it's just started here in Minnesota, and just a few minutes ago, they canceled the Minnesota State Fair for the first time in 75 years. And one of the only other times they had canceled it was for the flu pandemic in 1919. It was one of the only 2 or 3 times the thing's been canceled. So, but when you look at TV footage from like fairs in the past, like last year, it's just wall-to-wall people for like a week. And there's no way they're going to be able to have that this year. And they finally canceled it just a few minutes ago.
Wow, that's, well, another story to follow up on, and looking at what's happening in the urban centers with Native Americans, but also, on the reservations. Now, in all of this news, there are some major court cases going on. And so, Colby Kicking Woman, you spent a little bit of time at the U.S. Supreme Court. What was the first case you covered?
Yes, Patty, I am following a court case at the Supreme Court. It's called McGirt v. Oklahoma. It is a case of a man who was convicted of a crime by the state court, and he says that the crime was committed in the 1866 boundaries of the Creek Reservation, and so it was under federal jurisdiction, and he should have been tried by in federal court. It's tied to a case that was heard in the October 2018 term of Sharp v. Murphy. That court case was only heard by 8 judges because Justice Neil Gorsuch had to recuse himself because he heard that case when he was on the 10th Circuit of Appeals. They brought this case up, so they have a full all 9 judges on it, and so Justice Gorsuch is looked at as one of the swing votes that could tip it to either side.
All right, so that's the McGirt versus Oklahoma case there, and so interesting discussion with the justices. And for the first time, we actually could hear a Supreme Court case on teleconference, and now the justices are weighing that case, and hopefully we'll have some kind of an opinion later this year. The second case was the Mashpee versus the Department of Interior, Mashpee Wampanoag, regarding their land into trust situation there. What were the highlights on that one?
Yes, that case it was pretty long, and there's a lot of it seemed legalities in terms of M opinions, which are interpretations of the law from the Solicitor of the Interior, who is kind of the head attorney at the department. The attorney for Mashpee said that the evidence that the tribe put forth, that they were, although they were federally recognized in 2007, they brought forth evidence that they were under federal jurisdiction before 1934, and that the evidence that they brought forth was evidence the Interior has used in the past. And in this case, they viewed each piece of evidence individually and dismissed it. So it seemed a lot of back and forth about what was going on there.
All right. So again, lots of news happening that's not directly related to the pandemic. And certainly, though, the pandemic is impacting the Supreme Court because they're not in the chambers. They're hearing these cases over a teleconference call. So anything else you're working on right now, Colby?
Yes, I have been talking to natives who are running for, public office, whether at the state level or at the federal level, and how the pandemic has impacted campaigning, especially for first-time candidates, not being able to go to door and canvass, how does that change getting your name out there and name recognition?
That's a huge challenge. No, you can't go to powwows to campaign or anything like that. So, and yes, in the middle of all of this pandemic, we are preparing for a big election come November. So very good. Colby Kicking Woman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Patty.
And Eddie, the other story that you wrote recently just showed wonderful community spirit. And that was the story about how chefs in Minneapolis are coming together to help feed elders.
Right. It all started with Chef Brian Yazzie. He didn't work for the Minneapolis American Indian Center, but he's in nearby St. Paul. And since the center had shut down and they have a cafe there called the Gatherings Cafe. And of course it had shut down with the pandemic. And well, they were allowed to stay open only for deliveries and stuff like that, but it wasn't really catching on. They said they would sit around all day, maybe make 2 or 3 meals. So they had this idea, let's feed the elders in the Minneapolis community. So they got together and got a grant, and it took off, and they were making about 100 meals. And they would take them to some of the native housing centers here in Minneapolis for lunch, about 100 meals a day. Then they got more money, and they've since the story came out, they've since expanded to St. Paul, which is right, like 10 miles away, and their native community. So I think they're doing around 200 meals a day now. And it's indigenous themed, like bison and walleye fish and rabbit, and just Brian Yazzie has really got a good menu going over there.
Yes, Chef Yazzie, he's worked with the sous chef as well, and has quite the following. So to be able to bring someone like that to come in and make healthy meals for elders is pretty outstanding. And the menus I've seen posted are, makes me want to have some of them as well, because rabbit stew and all these wonderful traditional foods, wild rice, it sounds really wonderful. And there's a Native American housing community there that a lot of Native elders live at. So that's where they're delivering these food meals to?
Yeah, it's there. It's called Little Earth. And it's the first native preference urban housing in the country. And it's really a huge complex. It stretches over, it's got one of those skywalks that stretches over a major thoroughfare. And it's on both sides of the road. And it's from 1-bedrooms to townhomes. And it's pretty huge. And then there's another one. It's for, it's considered elderly housing. It's for those 62, I think, years old or over. And it's another different housing area. Then, St. Paul has their own. And a funny story about one of the elders I talked to, it was the day that they had got served that rabbit stew. And I asked her, what would you think, about eating rabbit? Has it been a long time? And she goes, well, when I was a kid, we ate it all the time, but I wouldn't eat it now because I love animals. So I said, what did you think of the stew today? She goes, the stew was fantastic today. It was great. It was out of this world, but she didn't know that she had just eaten rabbit stew. I guess she thought it was chicken. But she said it was great.
Everything tastes like chicken? Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, it's really heartwarming to hear stories like that, where communities coming together and taking care of elders who are living in the city. And along with the meals, they're also delivering sanitation items and also puzzles.
Yeah, stuff to keep them occupied, puzzles, and even on Easter, they included a colored Easter egg. They're just looking for ways, for one, to keep them from trying to get outside and get on a city bus and go somewhere. This way and not just the prepared food delivery, they have other food that drop-offs that have been set up on a regular schedule for these complexes.
Very good. And any story that you're working on right now for Indian Country Today?
Yeah, upcoming, should be out next week, is I talked to representatives at native schools like the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. I talked to President Robert Martin yesterday about, how the pandemic affected their semesters, what's their plans for summer and fall. I talked to Bacone College in Muskogee, Haskell, Nations in Lawrence, Kansas, and Fort Lewis in Durango. And to a T, just like everybody else in the country, mainly their semester was split down the middle, but when they went away for spring break, they never came back. That's when most of the stay-at-home orders went into effect. So all these schools, a lot of these students didn't come back from spring break, and especially when you're at a school like IA or Haskell, you could be living from Florida, New York State, state of Washington, Alaska, California. So it's just not easy to run, come back on spring break. And a lot of people had to leave their stuff in their dorms. Like in Haskell, they went in there and boxed it up and put it in storage for people who couldn't. I mean, if you're in Arizona, you're not going to be able to run back to Haskell and get your stuff, then go back to Arizona.
Sure.
So
well, that's a story that we'll be following as we continue on. Eddie,
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. Have a safe weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
This is Indian Country Today.